down to the footpad that was right on the surface, that we would test our ability to get back up again. Well, Neil did that very easily. He's a lot more athletic than he appears to be. Now, I was so confident when I got down to the bottom, when I jumped up, I missed. And so the dust from Neil's feet on the bottom rung of the ladder are on the shins of my suit. And that's where the smudges came from. So everybody has their little bit of trivia. I managed to get the camera away from Neil. He took most of the pictures, but I took 3 photographs that were unique. One, I photographed just a bare lunar surface. Then I put my foot down on it, and that's a classic picture, but that looked pretty lonely. So I decided to take a picture that showed the boot print and the boot that made the boot print. That's not Neil's, that's mine. I didn't get to put my name on the boot, but anyway, the lunar surface is such fine talcum powder, and it's probably 15, 20 feet deep, just all churned up from many, many impacts on the moon. And those impacts melted the moon and caused the little particles to go out, and then they would solidify so that when they would hit the ground, hit the surface again, they would fracture. And so the dust consists of lots of pieces of glass, little fine dust glass particles. And there's no air up there, so that when it gets pretty peppered a good bit, why, it tends to settle it down. So there are no air molecules between these dust particles. So when you get down an inch or two, it's very, very compact. And it's very hard to put the flag in and other things. We see some of the experiments that we put out there. In the background, you can see the flag, and also back near the spacecraft, there's a Swiss experiment that was put out sort of like a window shade, maybe 3 or 4 feet long, and it was collecting particles that for the 2 hours were coming from the sun. The sun emits the solar wind continuously for billions and billions of years, and it impacts on the surface of the moon. It never reaches the Earth because of the atmosphere and because of the radiation belts. But we had this experiment that was sort of like a window shade, and it, when we brought it back, could tell the Swiss experimenters just how many particles came from the sun. Now, the experiment that's in the foreground is a seismometer, and you pull little levers and it sort of unfolded itself out. And the experimenter said, now after you expose the solar panels to the sun, where it can rise, in this case it rises to the right of the screen and goes over to the left for 14 days of daylight and 14 days of darkness. And the experimenter said, don't walk in front of the panel because you'll interrupt the electricity going to the seismometer. Well, if you look very, very carefully, you can see some footprints just to the right of that experiment. And that's what the legal guys today call condemning evidence. That old Buzz walked in front of that panel after it had been deployed. So that's one of the reasons I want people to get back to the moon, so they can erase some of that condemning evidence. Now, I got paper clips up here to prepare me for this brisk wind, so that's why it takes a little bit of time. The next picture really is a classic of patriotism. Can you imagine the feeling that an American military person has standing next to the American flag and being able to salute it? The flag stands out at about 90 degrees, and you wonder, geez, how did you guys do that? Well, the rod that held the flag up locked into position 90 degrees, but it was supposed to telescope, but it was frozen and it didn't telescope, so it was kind of ruffled there. So we had to spread it out some to make it look like it was in a breeze. And even though when we lifted off, the exhaust of the ascent engine blew the flags over, you saw the force of that during the video film. But we didn't want to tell anyone that our flag blew over right away. We waited about 10 years later. But there's no doubt that of all the 6 flags on the 6 landing sites on the moon, that Apollo 11 had the best looking flag. Now, we had a lot of things to do. We got back in the spacecraft, tried to sleep. It got cold as could be. We turned up the heat as much as we could, but we had vented oxygen into the cabin twice. Once after we disconnected so we could throw over the backpacks and other things to lighten the weight of the liftoff. And the second time, we had to close the hatch and put oxygen back in again. So twice it had cooling oxygen in there, and we had a little bit of trouble sleeping that night. But we got up and I found a broken circuit breaker. It turned out to be the engine arm circuit breaker that had broken off. So we told Houston about that, and they had about 6 hours to figure out what they could do if we couldn't get that circuit breaker to stay in. But it did, and we lifted off, and of course, Dr. Rendezvous had to do all of his good work in addition to all the good information we had from the onboard computer and the tracking network. And we rendezvoused, left the moon, had wonderful pictures taken of the moon as we left, and then we re-entered at about 5.5, 6 Gs, and we landed in the Pacific Ocean. We were taken from that spacecraft, and we put on these suits and to protect the germs that we might have picked up, to protect you people from the germs. We had already been exposed to them, of course. We were inside the trailer, this little trailer that's to the right of the screen. And while we were in there, the flight surgeon came in and said, while the president and the Navy were getting their act together, said, would you like to see some film, TV film of what the reaction was on Earth when you guys landed? And they showed us pictures of London and Paris and Washington, all the crowds cheering, and I just couldn't resist. Here we were, very busy at that moment on the lunar surface, and now we're on the trailer, and we're seeing what happened 5 days earlier back in the States. And I couldn't resist tapping Neil on the shoulder and saying, Neil, hey, look up there. We missed the whole thing. Yeah, we missed because we were out of town when you guys were cheering their success. Well, the 3 of us were back on the carrier, Mike with his mustache, and we were still in quarantine. We stayed in quarantine for 21 days since we left the moon, and then we were involved in a 45-day round trip around the Earth, meeting kings and queens and all sorts of people. It was not exactly what I had bargained for. The changes that had happened during the letdown somewhat of what do I do next after I've been to the moon. I went back to the Air Force and commanded the test pilot school for a time, but that really wasn't too satisfying. I didn't tell you earlier that I had depression and suicide in my family. My grandfather had committed suicide on my mother's side, and she'd committed suicide a year before our flight to the moon. So this sort of thing was in the family, and I became somewhat prey to that depression, and alcoholism was mixed to it, and I went into treatment and now have 28 years of sobriety, probably one of the toughest things that I've done, but also one of the most satisfying. A little bit later, one of the more satisfying things came along when my domestic life sort of came apart, and I was beginning to put my life back together again, and I met that lovely lady, Lois Driggs from Phoenix, and we got married. It'll be 20 years this next Valentine's Day. So despite the fact that I lost about 10 years of effectiveness at age 50, 55, or 45, 50, I've stayed with the space program, and we have a wonderful, rewarding life now. We have a family of, I have 3 children in different parts of the world, and she has 3 children, but we have 2 cats. And the 2 cats look more and more like us every day. I've helped out in substance abuse programs, testifying to Congress, to the Senate, along with Carol O'Connor and Senator Max Cleland. I started scuba diving, as I mentioned earlier, in 1957, 50 years ago. Lois and I had this prenuptial that I would improve my skiing after age 50, and she would get checked out in scuba diving, which she's done. And so now we ski and we scuba dive in different parts of the world. As was mentioned earlier, I had another opportunity to do something a little bit more spectacular than scuba diving. Not only did I wear this yellow jacket, but I was in a yellow submarine with 2 Frenchmen, and we went down to see, the next slide, the Titanic. And I tell you, that's over 2 miles of water, and you just think about an hour and a half sinking down to the bottom slowly, and all of this water, black as could be. That's a lot of water. Even though on the surface of the globe of the Earth, it's a pretty thin little layer. It's pretty deep. So I decided I had to do a few other things. So I got to the North Pole with a Russian nuclear icebreaker. I decided to take up car racing once in the Long Beach Grand Prix, and I didn't finish first, but I did finish, and it was a great experience. I've written a good number of books since I've been back. My most satisfying to me is the science fiction story Encounter with Tiber, where aliens from Alpha Centauri came here to the Earth 6,000 years or 9,000 years ago. Since then, I wrote the children's book that you've seen earlier, and it shows a number of aspects of my life. It's been so successful, and what it really does is it takes a very, very lucky, in the right place at the right time, historical figure on a pedestal and brings him down to earth so that young kids can see that the things that I did as a young kid are the same kind of challenges that they face. Riding their bicycle, learning how to swim, getting involved in athletics, letting education move them along in earth. It is really education that has gotten me to where I am in life. And because of that, I've participated in the Buzz Aldrin Elementary School near Dulles Airport in Virginia. It's been in existence 10 years now. I formed a nonprofit that's called the Share Space Foundation, and it's that foundation that is the beneficiary of some of your donations here. There are T-shirts available for certain donations. ShareSpace really performs in 3 areas, 3 E's: experiences in space, and we have adventure awards, lotteries, sweepstakes, things like that for fortunate people who put up $50, $100 instead of $200,000 or $20 million to fly into space. So they have experiences. We help their education programs, starting in the state of California, with helping out each congressional district improve the education qualities for the parents within that congressional district. And the 3rd E is exploration. We want to support, especially in approaching election years, the exploration programs of NASA's. We want to do that by pointing out the benefits that were derived by exploration in the past, by celebrating the 40th anniversaries. So about a year from now, we'll be catching up with Mercury, Gemini, and overall Apollo. Then we'll group together Apollo 7 and 8 in October of '08, just before the election. I want to remind you that it's the person in the White House that determines the direction of our space program. And we've had 2 terms now that have reoriented our program in a particular way, away from just going into low Earth orbit with a laboratory. We're moving away from that into returning to exploration, returning to the moon, and onto Mars. Along with that exploration and those 40th anniversaries, talking about the past and the future, we have a good bit of tourism in space. Now, this is a very idealistic view of a big space hotel that might be rotating around. That's probably 30, 40, maybe 50 years off in the future. But we are starting with suborbital flights. And Burt Rutan, with the help of Paul Allen's finances, put together a demonstration with the White Knight 1 and the Spaceship 1, shown in this slide, designed by Burt Rutan, financed by Paul Allen, and licensed now to Richard Branson, and a much, much larger White Knight 2 will carry aloft a Spaceship 2, which will take 6 passengers and a crew of 2 into space. I was at one of the early test flights of this Spaceship 1, and here I'm shown congratulating Mike Melville in his successful first flight. The other thing that's been happening recently are zero-gravity flights. I've flown in 5 zero-gravity flights in 727 aircraft, which give you an exposure to Mars gravity, which is about 1/3 of what we have on Earth, lunar gravity, 1/6 of what we have, and then several flights, 8 or 10 flights of zero gravity, where everyone is floating around. And this is where it shows me floating around, experiencing zero gravity again. It's a very exhilarating experience, and we're going to have prizes for this experience as part of the lottery, share space, sweepstakes, whatever you might want to call it. We'll come up with a name, but we hope for this to be in effect before the year is out, so people for a contribution of $50 or $100 may be able to take a chance on being able to get into zero-gravity flight, eventually suborbital flight, and hopefully, when this expands beyond limited space advocacy groups to the public at large, we'll have this, the prizes will be flights into orbit. The primary purpose is to educate our young people by having them share experiences just to see what spaceflight is like. My group of engineers have been involved in designing the booster rockets that are reusable, that come back and land on a runway, and the spacecraft that can take people into orbit. We hope that one day some of the designs we've been working on will be a part of what we're available to do. We will maybe have something like the Lunar Olympics, and since I was a pole vaulter, I'd be very interested to see just how high somebody could pole vault in the lunar gravity. I've helped to develop strategies of getting to Mars with Mars Cycler spacecraft that are continuously in motion between the Earth and Mars. We will land people on Mars, maybe 2030, maybe 2035. The Hubble telescope is taking some marvelous pictures for us. And the last picture I want to show while I take you on a quick imaginary trip is of the neighboring galaxy to us, Andromeda. It's about the same size as our Milky Way galaxy, but it's about 20 times the diameter away. So it's over 1 million light years away. The diameter of our galaxy, which looks like this, is 100 100,000 light years in diameter. And just to travel 100 light years away would take, at half the speed of light, would take us 200 years to get there. Traveling real close to the speed of light, relativity takes in, and that doesn't help too much. Imagine that you're in a classroom or a lecture hall in a city on a planet that's 26 light years from Earth in the planetary system of the summer star Vega that was featured in Carl Sagan's movie Contact. Now, the year I'm taking you to is 2507, and your instructor is identifying on a hologram the original world of the human race. He points to Sol, and then he focuses on the third planet from the sun, the Earth, a brilliant jewel of a world with a magnificent moon, no longer a desolate moon, but now inhabited with industry. It's almost a twin planet system. The beauty of these rejuvenated worlds takes your breath away. Your instructor continues to speak. It was only 5 centuries ago that humanity first stepped off the planet Earth and onto another world. That world was the Earth's only moon, and looking back, the step seems to be a small one. Only 240,000 miles, just a little over what light travels in 1 second. But remember, until that time, humanity was not able to leave the Earth. It didn't have the knowledge or the means. That moment was a most important moment in our history, the time when it became possible to explore beyond the surface of that single planet, to realize our destiny of sending life to cold and empty worlds. What a time to have been alive. What I wouldn't give to have been alive there on Earth at that time. Just think of the adventure, the vision, the sense of destiny that surely must have existed when humanity first set foot on another world to explore, and then, after a brief wait, to venture outward again to settle the universe. Now, those are the thoughts and feelings that countless future generations will have as they think back to the second half of the 20th century. As Mecca is to the Muslim and Jerusalem is to many Christians and Jews, so the earth may become to future generations of humanity the place from which they sprang, the holiest of holy origins, or the Genesis. You are here at that very moment in history, and I guarantee you this is just the beginning. Thank you.